First off, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who watched last week's video. The response to that was absolutely tremendous. If you took the time to watch it, I greatly appreciate it. And if you missed it, I'll put a link up here somewhere so you can take a look at that if you like. And questions I got from last week's video are really the reason for this week's video on histograms and really how it relates to artistic expression. I got quite a few questions regarding histograms and from last week's video. And there was really two main questions. First question being how to use a histogram. Second question, how to use a histogram. So they both, of course, look 100% identical, but both questions have completely different meanings to it. So the first question really is, how to use a histogram, when you're in the field, in camera, what's the point of it? How do you get something out of it? So it's important to know exactly what a histogram is. And if you Google histogram, you look it up, you'll get a definition similar to, I believe it says, a histogram is a graphical representation of tonal values measuring from white, which is 100% brightness, to black, which is 0% brightness. Or some rendition of that is the technical definition of what a histogram is. And if you look in Lightroom right here, you have your y-axis and you have your x-axis. And this is the same type of histogram that you're going to see in camera. Most cameras today have either a luminance histogram, which is just a gray histogram showing light values. And then you have the RGB, which is the red channel, green channel, blue channel histogram. A lot of cameras have that as well. And Lightroom actually shows you both histograms combined. So along the x-axis, or the horizontal axis along the bottom, you have on the far left absolute black. On the far right, you have white, or absolute white, 100% brightness. And then you have the shadow areas here, and then you have your midtones in the middle, you have your highlights over here, and then you have, of course, pure white over here. And then the y-axis, the vertical axis here, this actually measures the amount of pixels in the scene that correlate to that luminance value, that brightness or darkness, or that specific color. So how much of that color is in the scene, or how much of that midtone is in the scene. So that's the technical jargon of what a histogram is, and that's exactly how it works. So what does it ultimately mean? What's the point? Can I just look at my LCD screen? And yeah, you can do that. A lot of beginning photographers do that. I certainly did for a while. The problem with it is three problems. First problem, LCD screens on cameras today, they're getting better, but they're still not that great. Two, they're hard to see in sunlight or a bright day or anything like that. It's just difficult to see, a lot of glare. And the third problem is you can actually artificially create how bright or dark your LCD screen actually is. So if you have the brightness value of your LCD screen turned up, you're artificially overexposing your images, at least what they look like to you. And the same thing on the adverse side, if you have your LCD brightness level turned down, you're making your images look a little bit underexposed. So it's just not as clean to just look at the histogram. And I know histogram might look a little intimidating, but once you get used to it, and you'll be able to look at it and within 1 second realize if you need to make any tweaks to your settings. If you're at a scene and you're looking through your camera, you're looking on your LCD and your histogram, all the tones are piled up on the right. It's basically saying that maybe your image might be a little overexposed. So maybe you dial in a little negative exposure compensation, or you close down your aperture, or you increase your shutter speed, whatever combination you want to do, but ultimately let less light in to the sensor. And if your histogram is piled up on the left side, it's basically saying that, hey, maybe this image is a little underexposed. You need to let a little bit more light into the sensor. So you could increase add positive exposure compensation, or you could increase the size of your aperture, or slow down the shutter speed, or increase ISO, whatever it is to possibly brighten the image. And that is really all I use the histogram for when I'm on location, is just to kind of figure out, how well exposed is this scene. Granted, a lot of times your vision of the scene is not to have it perfectly exposed. Maybe it's supposed to be a darker, moodier image, or maybe it's supposed to be a high key image, a very bright scene. And that is a very important thing with histograms, is that a histogram is nothing more than a mathematical algorithm It's a computer program. It's not an artist. It's not a photographer. It doesn't understand artistic expression. It doesn't understand what looks good, what looks bad. It has no opinion. It is just going to tell you what percentage of pixels in this scene are bright versus what percentage of pixels in this scene are gray or black. And that is it. So you kind of got to take it with a grain of salt and really just use it as a guide. So the second part of this question, how do you use a histogram? It really kind of relates to, how do you use it after you've taken your photo? So you get back home, you load your photos in the Lightroom or whatever post-processing software you're using. How do you use your histogram at that point? So let me pull up an image here. Let's see what this one. So this is a final image of mine from a couple months ago, actually. And then here is the actual raw image. And you can see from the histogram up here that there's a lot of data or a lot of tones piled up on the right side, indicating possibly an overexposed image, or possibly maybe I blew out my highlights or a clipping highlights, which is not a good thing. And let me go to the develop module here. So you'll see how the histogram is actually broken out. You'll see how when you hover over it, the area turns gray and it'll say what it is. Like this is the exposure area or the midtones. This area here is the highlights, and this is the whites. And as you scroll back and forth, you'll see it changes. And if you look down here too, so like look at the highlights and shadows section here. If I roll over the shadows, it's highlighted. And then if I go over here to highlights, it's highlighted. I know that might sound confusing. And then same thing with the whites and blacks. So as you move across the histogram, the corresponding slider will automatically highlight as well. And the same thing if you go down the actual slider. So if you run your cursor over the sliders, if you look at the top of the histogram, the area that is affected by that particular slider will be highlighted. And the last thing you could to know is you could actually adjust I don't do this, but you can actually adjust your sliders actually on the histogram. So if I wanted to say adjust my shadows, I could just go over here to the shadow area, click down and just move it up or down. And if you look at the bottom here, you'll notice that, that the shadow area moves as I move the slider up and down. Like I mentioned, I never ever do that, but the option is there if you want to. Probably the most useful feature in my opinion is the shortcut key J. So if you hit J, that is automatically going to turn on your clipping indicators. So there's two different clipping indicators. You have a highlight clipping indicator and a shadow clipping indicator. Highlights are always identified in red. Clip shadows are always identified in blue. So it's very important to know. So you have these little triangles in the top left hand and top right hand corner of your histogram. The left indicates shadows. It's not highlighted because there's no area of this image that has clipped shadows. But the highlight clipping indicator is highlighted because, as you can see, there's areas of the clouds that are clipped. And what clipping is, so clipped highlight is basically an area of a scene that is so bright it is pure white. There is no data. Clipped shadows is areas of a scene that are so dark there is no data in there. And once you capture the scene, if you capture it with no data, there's just no data. It's unrecoverable. You can't pull detail out of no data. You can't pull something out of nothing. And I never really got this for a long time when I heard photographers talk about trying to capture as much data in a scene, as much information, so you have it when you go to post-process an image. And I never really got that. But what kind of helped me to understand is, if you think about it, if you're at the beach and you have a bucket and you take your bucket and you scrape it across the beach and you look in your bucket and you see you got a lot of sand, and each individual granule of sand represents a pixel. The deeper you run your bucket into the beach, the more sand you're going to get. And that's ultimately the goal in photography, is you want to capture as much information in the scene as possible. So if you blow out your highlights and you blow out your shadows, you're not capturing any of that data. Or if you don't have much data in your midtones, you're missing out on all that. And you want to have as much data as possible so you have more to work with when you go to post-process the image. So, and what we'll do here is let's artificially create some clipped shadows. So we'll just bring the blacks all the way down. And you can see the blue identifying clipped shadows. So we'll set that back. But like I said, you're not going to be able to recover clipped highlights, but you can actually bring the highlights down and you can see that the red slowly goes away. And you could leave it there, or you could bring down the overall exposure of your image. to remove the highlights. I don't really, or remove the clipped highlights. I don't really recommend that. But for this image, I would just bring down the highlights until it's gone. And it's okay if there happens to be a little bit of clipped areas in the highlights or shadows. It's not that big a deal. But I use the clipping indicator, shortcut key J. Definitely remember that. I utilize it a lot. And cameras today, the dynamic range is insane. So sometimes when Lightroom says that an area is clipped and there is no data, there might still be a little bit of data in there. But better safe than sorry. Just don't clip your highlights and your shadows like I did in this image. But ultimately, this is the final image here. I really do like this photo a lot. Let me turn up the brightness of my screen. But and you can see that there's still some areas in the surf here that I clipped the highlights, but it's okay. Now the other portion of this, now that you know, we've gone over what the histogram looks like in Lightroom and how you use it and how you can use clipping and to identify areas of your scene that you need to adjust. But how the histogram relates to artistic expression is rather interesting. Like we spoke about in the beginning, it's just a computer algorithm. It's got no personality and it doesn't know what looks good and what looks bad. And I got a couple of examples here I wanted to go over. So, this is an image. This is what the raw image looked like. Let me turn the clipping indicator off, of a scene I took a month or so ago. And as you can see, especially by the histogram, this is a very dark image, and it is done on purpose. It's a very moody image. And if I hold down Shift and I double click on exposure, Lightroom is basically saying that in order to properly expose this image, I need to add over 3.5 stops of exposure to properly expose this. And as you can see, it looks absolutely horrible. This is the final image here of what I wanted it to look like. So, a darker, moodier image. So just because the histogram says that it needs to look a certain way to properly expose it has absolutely no bearing on your artistic idea or what you have in mind for that particular scene. A histogram should really only be used as a guide for exposure, and that's really it, in my personal opinion. Let me put this back. I have another example here too. So this is an image. This is the final image of the Nepali coast in Kauai, and this is the actual raw file here. So once again, if I hit Shift, double click exposure, Lightroom's saying that I need to add over a full stop of exposure to this image, but looking at that doesn't fit what I have in my mind at all for this scene. So this is the final image, and this is what I wanted it to look like. I wanted the mountains to be silhouetted and against the setting sun in the background. I want it to be a darker image. And no, it's not exposed properly according to the histogram or Lightroom, but it fits exactly what I wanted this overall scene to look like. This was my artistic vision for this scene. So ultimately, you really got to take a histogram with a grain of salt. It's definitely not the end-all be-all. It is a very good guide to use when you're in the field, and it's a great guide to use when you're post-processing. But at the end of the day, whatever fits your vision, that's what you want to go with. That's what's most important. That trumps anything else that some obscure algorithm has come up with. So I hope the video wasn't too teched out or too dirty or anything like that. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, absolutely leave them in the comments below, and I guarantee I'll get back to you. If you enjoyed the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed to my channel already, if you could subscribe, it would definitely mean a lot to me. And I appreciate you watching, and I will see you all next week. Bye.